What you see here on the table, Pastor, is, in a nutshell, the history of the King James Bible. Now remember, this King James Bible was printed in 1611, and there's a common misconception out there that it was the first English. Well, it wasn't. There were numerous other English examples before 1611. And what you see here starts with the original Greek, as you just said, Textus Receptus, done by Erasmus of Rotterdam. Well, let's just call Erasmus what he is, the smartest man that ever lived. And this is the book that launches the Reformation. Even as an atheist, you acknowledge this is the most important book ever printed. The Renaissance is launched from this. The truth comes from this book. And so we see just how imperative this book is, but what it also did was cause an enormity of problems. And what do I mean by that? Well, the money stopped flowing to Rome.
Although this pastor, this creator, is technically correct in the effects of Erasmus within the Renaissance environment, we must remember that Erasmus wasn't around until the 16th century, okay? The 16th century, which means that he was in the 1500s. The Renaissance began almost, well, definitely a century prior to that. To say that his book created the Renaissance, was the most important book in reference to the Renaissance, is downplaying other authors who actually were more impactful so that Erasmus could even do what he did. So let's break it down. The Renaissance technically began in and around the early 1400s BCE. CE, 1400. So that's the 15th century. It began when Constantinople, the final Roman Empire, fell to the Ottomans. At that point, the power of Rome began to diminish, and so the money stopped flowing to Rome. The money stopped flowing to Rome because with the fall of Constantinople, then the European people started looking more into ancient Greek, ancient Roman writings. They started looking at humanism. They began to look at the writings of Plato and Aristotle. They began to develop their love for the corpus hermeticum, and many sought out to have the ancient wisdom brought back forward because they felt Europe was losing its focus, as well as the fact that now the church does not have the military might that it once had before. Many say that the Renaissance began in Italy. That is debatable, but we do know that other areas of Italy, like such as Florence, which is the main area, did begin to exert power beyond the power of the Pope. And since they began to exert power and not respect the Pope as much because the Pope now doesn't have the military backing that it once had before, Florentines had their own military, they had their own militias. So it enabled people like Cosimo Medici to pay his scribes to go out and bring back the knowledge of ancient Greece, the knowledge of ancient Rome, which is also the knowledge of ancient Levant, ancient Mesopotamia, ancient Egypt. So in doing so, with these writings and understanding from Pythagoras and from the Egyptian writing, the Book of the Dead, and so on and so forth, they've formed and developed the Corpus Hermeticum, which with the Corpus Hermeticum, you begin to get the writings of Dante. Dante is probably more impactful to the beginning of the Renaissance than the writings of I'm saying his name so messed up. Eramus. Eramus was more impactful in the movement of the Reformation of the church, but not the Renaissance itself. There is a separation, but it's separated by a very gray line because when they looked at the Corpus Hermeticum, when they looked at Neoplatonism, Stoicism, when they looked at all these other humanistic writings, they looked at it as it worked within the church and started to realize what Erasmus eventually got to was the criticism of the Roman, what would become the Roman Catholic Church, the criticisms of how they looked at divinity, how they looked at man's role in divinity, how they looked at the church's role in government, they begin to separate through politics. Like Chaucer, later on in his plays of the Canterbury Tales, it delves into the politics and what's going on with the church in A Knight's Tale, not the movie, but A Knight's Tale, of how love and politics and the human experience moves in conjunction with the church. But even before that, you had Machiavelli and the Machiavellian writings, which gave you a real idea of what politics and power and lifestyle was like during that time frame, and not the one that is created by the imaginations of the church and or by the strictness of the church. Certainly Erasmus has its place. And if the creator would have just stuck to how from Erasmus you get to the King James Bible, how you get to the Protestant Reformation, which the Protestants it means to protest, and they was protesting the church. The idea of the Renaissance, though, that inspired people like Michelangelo, like Da Vinci, who were coined as Renaissance men, that's totally different and actually comes from more secular writings that they merged in with their Christian writings in order to create this Renaissance that began to happen in Europe. So the rest of his video was good, informative, gives you a direct line to the 1611 King James Bible, and he definitely knows that. But it also demonstrates how people have their biases and they will cultivate information of the past in order to fit their bias and instead of just looking at what the facts are. There were so many. I mean, Dante's Divine Comedy, which is more dealing with the human experience with divinity, is more had, like I said, had more of an impact on people's mindsets and thought processes, and allow people to think about religion outside of the church. And it is that power that created the Renaissance in Europe. And there are so many other writings. And then later on, when you get your Shakespearean writings, there's so much more that impacted the Renaissance. The creator should have stuck with the Reformation of the church and not the Renaissance itself. And the most impactful, other than Dante's Divine Comedy, was major. But what they won't mention is how impactful the Corpus Hermeticum was, and how impactful the ideas of Hermeticism and alchemy. Alchemy became something that they were Christians, but it became something that the higher thinking Christians began to consider and had to do in the dark, especially as time went on. Yet many kings and queens hired alchemists to work within their courts. So alchemy was a major player throughout the entire Renaissance, and all of that comes from the Corpus Hermeticum, which comes from the uh, Mediterranean area of the Mesopotamia and Egypt. So if you really want to get into the Renaissance, dig deeper than what Google is going to tell you, and go into the Corpus Hermeticum, go into alchemy, understand the 7 laws of Hermeticism, and you will have a deeper and better understanding of it. And Machiavellian's The Prince is an awesome read. It's an awesome read. I've read that probably about 7 or 8, 9 times, but it's an awesome read. So what do you guys think? And always remember, you have to free yourself to be yourself, because your greatness is non-negotiable. Good journey, good vibrations.